Thank you. And just to introduce you, please. Hello. We need your to be patient a little bit more. Sébastien Marot is a philosopher, so we and trained as a philosopher, and he practiced as a critic of architecture and landscape. Could you please listen? Thank you. And he's been program director of Société Française d'Architecture between 1986 and 2003. In the same period, he has been chief editor of a journal of architecture, so to say, Les Visiteurs, and has been teaching extensively in Europe and abroad, in the States and Canada also. He has been very much involved with the theme of the suburbanism, that is also the topic of his lecture today. And when the interesting connotation related to the art of memory. Memory, as you know, is a kind of deleted words when we are talking about functions and program at urban scale or at the scale of a building, but actually is what is affect our environment and our behaviors more than any other, let's say, functionality and performance aspects in our daily life. I would like to thank you again, Marot, to have accepted to be here for these few days, and we look forward to listen to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I was totally uninspired as to the title of the lecture, so I just called it 2 or 3 thoughts about the present situations of cities and territories or landscapes. I realize I have overloaded that lecture with image, so it will be a kind of blitzkrieg of images and very few thoughts, but very illustrated. As I was invited to participate more specifically into a workshop on writing and architecture, I'll start by reading a text, which is, for me, a little building in itself. I love it, and so I'll read it. It's by Vladimir Nabokov in his courses that he gave in the 50s at Cornell University, and it was during a course on Kafka's The Metamorphosis, and at some point he asks himself, what is reality? And to explain what is reality, he's going to look at what a landscape is, right? So let us take 3 types of men walking through the same landscape. Number 1 is a city man on a well-deserved vacation. Number 2 is a professional botanist. Number 3 is a local farmer. Number 1, the city man, is what is called a realistic, commonsensical, matter-of-fact type. He sees trees as trees and knows from his map that the road he's following is a nice new road leading to Newton, where there is a nice eating place recommended to him by a friend in his office. The botanist looks around and sees his environment in the very exact terms of plant life. Precise biological and classified units such as specific trees and grasses, flowers and ferns. And for him, this is reality. To him, the word of the stolid tourist who cannot distinguish an oak from an elm seems a fantastic, vague, dreamy, never world. Finally, the world of the local farmer differs from the 2 others in that his world is intensely emotional and personal, since he has been born and bred there and knows every trail and individual tree and every shadow from every tree across every trail, all in warm connection with his everyday work and his childhood, and 1,000 small things and patterns which the other two, the humdrum tourist and the botanical taxonomist, simply cannot know in the given place at the given time. Our farmer will not know the relation of the surrounding vegetation to a botanical conception of the world, and the botanist will know nothing of any importance to him about that barn or that old field or that old house under its cottonwoods, which are afloat, as it were, in a medium of personal memories for one who was born there. It's not finished. There's a second page. So, here we have three different worlds, three men, ordinary men, who have different realities. And of course, we could bring in a number of other beings. A blind man with a dog, a hunter with a dog with his man, a painter cruising in quest of a sunset, a girl out of gas. In every case, it would be a world completely different from the rest, since the most objective words, tree, road, flower, sky, barn, thumb, rain, have in each totally different subjective connotations. Indeed, this subjective life is so strong that it makes an empty and broken shell of the so-called objective existence. The only way back to objective reality is the following one. We can take these several individual worlds, mix them thoroughly together, scoop up a drop of that mixture, and call it objective reality. We may taste in it a particle of madness, if a lunatic passed through that locality, or a particle of complete and beautiful nonsense, if a man has been looking at a lovely field and imagining upon it a lovely factory producing buttons or bombs. But on the whole, these mad particles would be diluted in the drop of objective reality that we hold up to the light in our test tube. Moreover, this objective reality will contain something that transcends optical illusions and laboratory tests. It will have elements of poetry, of lofty emotion, of energy and endeavor, and even here the button king may find his rightful place. Of pity, pride, passion, and the craving for a thick steak at the recommended roadside eating place. So when we say reality, we are really thinking of all this in one drop, an average sample of a mixture of 1,000,000 individual realities. And this makes our task quite difficult, right? All right. When we are in a design situations, we could sum up that situation by being in between this, an unsatisfactory or abandoned or wasted situation, and this, like a program, a new idea for occupying or using that situation. When we are in this transition, we leave this transition with different kinds of ideals. If I go back to philosophy, in the course of the 20th century, and even the second part of the 20th century, we have witnessed, in a way, a radical change of agenda, right? I sum that up. I see that Paola Vigano does that too a lot. Sum it up by the covers of two books. Not necessarily that they were super important books, but that in their title, they in a way grasp those two situations. One is Ernst Bloch, The Principal Hope, where Ernst Bloch, this Marxist philosopher, was kind of not criticizing Marx, but improving Marx, saying there is not only, materialist history, there is not only infrastructures and their evolution which build the situation, but hope has always been a kind of driving force, and he wanted to re-inject the importance of hope, of utopia, within historical materialism, right? And so he made a kind of plea for architecture, for hope, for projects, for, you know, and saying these two have been driving things, right? A projected future, even if we didn't manage to make our way to it, in a way was a force, and we have to institute hope within history. Then, of course, things happened in the second half of the 20th century that led people to question that importance of hope, or in the hierarchy of moving forces. And 30 years after that, Hans Jonas, another German philosopher, published a book which title was, I'm sorry, these are the French covers, but The Principle Responsibility, saying, well, now it might be wondered whether the issue at hand is really improving the world, is really dreaming of a kind of better future, but if instead it wouldn't be, the question wouldn't be, how are we going to manage to pass on to future generation a world that would be as good as the one we lived in? So all of a sudden, it's a complete change, right, of stakes, right? Are we going to be able to pass on, to transmit, to bequeath future generations a world as livable as the one we ourselves inherited from the past generations? So you have a complete change, you know, from the principle hope to the principle responsibility or prudence. Of course, it's an old story in philosophy. It didn't just pop up, you know, in the last decades. If you look back at the School of Athens, which you can go and admire in the Vatican, the Raphael painting showing all the philosophers characterized, each of them by a specific gesture, you know, that sums up, in a way, his philosophical attitude. So you have a ballet of hand gestures, which are all philosophical hands. And it's particularly the case for the two central figures that you see here, like Plato on the left and Aristotle on the right. You know, you see Plato like raising up one index hand, like showing up, you know, the reality up in the sky, the pure essence, you know. And it's interesting because his gesture is totally inscribed in the architectural pilaster which is behind, you know, as if the task of philosophy and architecture was to upheave the world, you know, to a better state, in a way. And then Aristotle on the right has a completely different gesture, right? Not one index, not one thing, right? All open hand, the palm turned toward the earth, you know, the sublunar lunar world, right? As if to say, well, maybe it's interesting to look up, you know, to the ideal, but we shouldn't overlook the earth, the limits of real and physical economy, you know, and maybe we should be careful, you know, looking at the way things really are happening down here, right? And it has limits, etc. So the principle of prudence, in a way, opposed to that one. So in a way, Bloch and Jonas re-edited that kind of gap between the two things. When I read the explanation of what was going to happen during those 2 weeks and the importance given to waste area, abandoned areas, it reminded me, and I'm going to show a lot of books here, again, writing and architecture, a lot of books which I think deserve to be reopened and re-leafed through, right? And we all know Kevin Lynch. We are supposed to know Kevin Lynch in schools of architecture. And if we know him, it's generally for one book published in 1960 called The Image of the City. But generally in Europe and even in the United States, we have forgotten that he published many other books after that, right? And the last one that was published posthumously in 1990, he died 6 years before, is called Wasting Away. And it is a really important book because it's a book that registers the idea that maybe our discipline, architecture, landscape design, urbanism, are just different instances of a kind of overall art, which is the art of recycling. We are always recycling stuff, materials, ideas, etc. We cannot do anything without, materials which are by definition already there, right? So and I'm going to leaf through, but this is what he says. Waste and loss are the dark side of change, a both repressed and highly emotional topic. There is a pornography of wastes, just as there is a pornography of sex and death. What does that mean? Pornography means, it's obvious, it's there, it's graphic in a way, and for that very reason, we don't look that much to those processes, and we do not enable ourselves to deal with those situations. Reason for what? The mafia, makes waste its own area, makes a lot of money, and makes a lot of horrible things with it, but it's not something that we really, take responsibility for and work with in a way. So he was advocating a complete change of conception of our discipline, all our discipline. We are not doing anything else than recycling. Inventing, of course, but while recycling. I'm just leafing through. It's also because I show that because Lynch's book were pretty inventive, mixing up, all kinds of views about the subject. So it was about, the processes of waste and the importance they take in the territory. In the cities, of course, but it was also about the waste of place. The waste of places, the time of waste. Wastelands, he said, and we are basically still saying the same kinds of things, as if we needed to say them. Wastelands and abandoned plots are places of hopelessness, but they also shelter relics and burgeoning forms of new things, religions or politics. They are refuges for dreams, for antisocial or marginal activities, places where one may explore and grow up. So focusing, as you will do, on those places is exactly embarking into the adventure that Kevin Lynch was, in a way, inviting us back in the 80s to do. And so he was looking, at all these processes, explaining, so this city of Iraq, standing on 3 millennium or 4 millennium or 5 millenniums of waste, that is the so-called, the site of the city, looking at gardens like the Tuileries gardens, many landscape works as in fact having been ways of reclaiming industrial sites. It has been a whole process throughout history to do that, looking at art, the art of waste, then as well, sorry, too many images. Images like that, What can be done with freeways after the automobile age? Can we plan our what we do, our projects, having in mind that they will have to be recycled after that, So he was posing all these questions which have become common sense nowadays. Looking at this art of waste, Kurt Schwitters, Merzbau, Tinguely, work at the time, projects by Léon Krier to reclaim an abandoned interchange highway, looking at Gordon Matta-Clark in the early 80s or Charles Simons, who built those tiny pueblos, you know, on the corners of windows in New York and abandoned them like that. And this related back to another book he had done in the early 70s, which he always considered himself as his best book and most important book, much more important than The Image of the City, which is called, it's very difficult to translate in any language, What Time Is This Place, right? The issue of time was the absolutely important issue that architect had to deal with. This is how he explained the subject of the book. The book deals with time, and as it manifests itself in the physical reality of the world, with the way its external signs corresponds or not to our internal experience of time, and with the means of making this external-internal relationship more satisfying and more stimulating. It thus browses through issues ranging from historical preservation to different forms of transition, including futurism, the marks of time, the aesthetics of time, biological rhythm, the perception of time, disasters, resources, and revolution, right? Architects, designers are working in space-time, not just in space, right? And this was, at that time, a very important message, you know, and he would refer to Ovid's metamorphosis right in the beginning of the text. We are, in a way, operating metamorphosis in this space-time matrix, and this is absolutely essential. The idea of the book, he said, is that the quality of their personal image of time is crucial for the well-being of individuals, as for the success of the efforts we make to master the transformation or the evolution of our environment. And also that our material environment actually plays a role in the building and maintaining of this image of time. The relation is thus reciprocal. So, no better ways of explaining that we are living in a kind of milieu, you know, of space, time. And he would look, you know, in the same way, illustrating several transformation issues of preservation, where one given city, such as Bath, for instance, is prisoner in its past, right? While others are completely neglected ancient potteries at that time. Going through Boston, which was his own ecological niche at the MIT, and you know, browsing all the signs of the inscription of time in the city, whether historical, whether, you know, gaps between buildings built in very different periods, etc., etc. Okay, just have a look at those two books. I think Wasting Away has been actually translated in Italian under the title Deperire. You should, I think, look very carefully to this book, and of course to this one of the most important books of the late 20th century. Okay, where already in '72, he was looking at Smithson's work, right? Quoting Smithson, who had said this thing: the more I think of steel, the more rust becomes its fundamental quality. In the technological mind, rust suggests the ghost of uselessness, entropy, and ruin. But the fact that steel is ranked above rust proceeds from a technological statement, not an artistic one. And you could add, not an architectural one. And there is this sentence in the middle of the book, which I really like. Hope goes with nostalgia. Hope and nostalgia are completely related issue. I like to quote this in a school of architecture because I think nostalgia has become, for some reason, a capital sin in schools of architecture. Every time I sit in a jury, in a review, at some point there is one of the professors, usually dressed in black, you know, who's going to say, "Isn't your project a bit nostalgic?" And that kills the guy. You know, that's completely kills it. And of course, sometimes there are good reasons to say such a thing, right? But there are also, in many situations, it's just a kind of automatic pilot of architects, you know, hating nostalgia. And I would say repressing nostalgia. You cannot be so eager to denounce nostalgia in other projects unless you're not nostalgic yourself, because you know that this is something, you know, that which is around. You know that's the devil you have to protect yourself from, which is bizarre, because nostalgia is not a sin in itself. It's an effect, right? It's something you feel, right? And as everything you feel, the problem is what you do with what you feel. If you just drown yourself in your feeling, right, that's probably bad. But if you use your affect, and what can we use except affects, you know, in life, to do something, you know, with it, to acknowledge it instead of repressing it, right, then you could, maybe that's stupid, and there are historians that are going to tell me this is mad. But couldn't you describe Renaissance as a gigantic movement of nostalgia, partly, right? Of a kind of nostalgia for a kind of ideal Roman age, you know, etc. So a kind of, etc. So nostalgia is not bad in itself, and the first thing I think is important is not to repress it, but to use it, right? Repressing things is never, never good. When Lynch worked at the MIT and published What Time Is This Place, he was working very closely with another guy who coined an expression that I also very much like, which is the arts of the environment. You know that back in the 70s, everything was about the sciences of the environment. And this guy, Georgi Kepes, published his last book, gathering scientists, architects. You see artists like Robert Smithson, Kevin Lynch, Edward T. Hall, specialist of systems dynamics at the MIT lab, around the issue of the environment and describing architecture, urbanism as, you know, as many issues of arts of the environment. So you would have later Lynch saying, all our disciplines are recycling. He was saying 10 years before, all our disciplines are arts of the environment. And we have to work with the sciences of the environment, and this is the very important issue. This is what he said in that book. The wild industrialization and urbanization of the planet will soon be complete. The cannibalism of the environment, which has devoured the earth, the water, and the sky, leaving us only with the toxic corpse of the living riches of yesterday, has made us painfully aware of the fact that man is on the verge of ecological suicide. The sense of the ecological climax, of the peaceful balance between man and the environment, is just a memory in this world which is itself no more than a labyrinth of ecological dead ends where we are desperately looking for the exit. But some signs let us hope that the vicious spiral of degradation might be brought to an end. And at the MIT, where they were working, all these guys, of course, was published this immense book in '72, exactly the same moment, in the lab of systems dynamics, The Limits to Growth, which is really a turning point in the history of ecological concern, as you know, since it was, you know, projecting, in a way, reading a projection of disaster, of total economical collapse, on the horizon of the first third of the 21st century. Basically, it was saying, if everything goes, you know, the same way, business as usual, you know, as it goes today until 72, then we can expect, you know, and then it was an incredible. Do you read this book today? You might better. It's a very interesting book still today, and you might read the different updates, because they were young guys who did that in 72, and 20 years after they did a 20-year update, and 30 years after they did a 30 years update, the last one, which you should read, which basically confirmed their previous projections, except that delay in taking action had only made things worse, right? So basically the message was, it was several scenarios, you know. Basically the message was they were all individually going into the wall. Because, you know, people would say, yeah, told them, yeah, but you know, there are much more resources than you think in the earth, and we're going to find them, etc. And so they took that scenario. They said, okay, let's hypothetically double the amount of available resource on Earth and see what our projection produce. And they said, not bad, because maybe the crisis will be 10 years after or 20 years after, but it would be worse, of course, because in the meantime, you know, the production would have grown higher, etc. So even the expectation or the hypothesis that there were more resources on Earth, double, went into the wall. Other people said, oh yeah, okay, but maybe we could, you know, control demography, do like China for a certain period, you know, at the scale of the world. And then they entered that thing and they said, yeah, maybe it could like curve a little the decline, but it will happen all the same within the 21st century. Then people said, yes, but, you know, like factor fear. We're going to be much more efficient in the use of existing resources. So they couldn't project a curve of energy efficiency, for instance, but they could manage with their model, and they said, yes, also it would curve a bit the thing, but it will go down all the same, etc. There was no scenario that was fine, except one where you combine them all, where you hope there is more than you know, where you become more efficient, where you control demography, where you accept to live on a kind of living. They said in 72 the world could sustainably live at the level of Portugal at that time. So you see, since then we are so... So Kepes was trying to draw lessons from that, right, on the other side of the corridor at MIT, in the field of architecture, urbanism, etc. And his idea was that a real conscience of our ecological situation must be amplified by deep artistic experiences, able to turn our shallow indignation into a genuine and durable conviction. So artists, architects, planners had a major role to play, right, into bringing up that conscience through their very work, right, into the city and into the world. And so again, I'm browsing through the pages of that very, very important book, which convinced me 10 years ago that the best thing I could do in a school of architecture was not anymore to teach anything else than the history of the environment. So this is actually what I do now in school. I teach the history of the environment. Okay. These are for reading. So Smithson published actually his Spiral Jetty for the first time in that very book, etc. I was yesterday at the Venice Biennale to visit again, because I had been there the first day, the exhibition on the elements that Colas did. So I can say no bad things about it, since I was a bit part of it. I studied one of these elements, the one that I am the most interested in, which is, of course, the fireplace, which is the issue of energy in building. I just want to say one thing. When Colas was planning the exhibition, at some point, I made a suggestion, and I'm sad he didn't follow it. It was a very side suggestion, marginal suggestion. It was to have a room where you would illustrate, not, give artistic photos of the elements, taken like that, montage of things, but to try to give through the equivalent of each of these elements in the broader territory, to make a kind of portrait of the situation and context within which the evolution of the elements that he's documenting at the scale of architecture happens, right? What is the background of this evolution of each of the elements in buildings today? It would have been a stupid thing, but just to do, something like that. Toilet is an element. It has a kind of equivalent in the landscape, right? Stupid. Elevator, also. I just take images like corridor. You find many corridors in the landscape, and you could do the elements of the territory. The fireplace, I don't need to explain, right? So if the fireplace has disappeared as an element from architecture, it's because it has appeared elsewhere, right? So it's not to make a kind of stupid critical statement about that. It's just to show the other end of the chain, right? And to look at the background which allows this specific evolution of each of the elements in building. So it's a stupid thing. I will not insist. All right. So what I see in our milieu, in our field, is an incredible accumulation of repressed nostalgia. And I think we should, like on the bridges of Venice, where lovers, have make padlocks on every bridge, we should unchain, unlock our nostalgia and use it, right? And be a little kind with our nostalgia, because it has a certain number of justifications, I think. Another idea. 20 years ago, looking at what was happening in the field of urbanism, I was struck in France, from Paris, where I work, by the rising importance of landscape architects into the debate on urbanism. And I tried to understand what was happening, what was behind that, right? One of my friends, Jacques Lucan, had written a very nasty article on landscape architects saying, yeah, we understand why they have a big success. It's only for very stupid reasons. First, they have the manie pulite. They didn't, go into the reconstruction stuff, etc. So they are not responsible for the mistakes, of the late modern stuff. So now we are ready to give them total confidence in things. And then the other reason he advanced is people like them because they have strictly no idea about the city. The city is not their subject. They have absolutely no theory about the city, and this is like that. So at that time, I wrote a little article against this one, saying, first, the fact that they have no discourse to sell on the city might be a good thing. Because we've been pretty fed up with architects having all their ideas about the city, etc. And actually, since then, I was thinking, one day I read a very beautiful text by Václav Havel, the ex-president of Czechoslovakia, when he was a prisoner in his own country, and he was given a prize in Germany, a Goethe Prize, and he wrote a little discourse from his jail that he sent. It was called "A Few Words About Words." And he said, he explained why he couldn't use anymore a word that he loved on principle, which was the word socialism. Because socialism, had such a history in the century, had been a suitcase in which all kinds of stuff had been packed, you know, that you couldn't like sort out the content of this. And he said, this is a word that is useless now. I just can't, it doesn't mean anything, you know. That meant so much different and opposite stuff that using it is like rendering yourself unable in a way, right? Disabling yourself, right? So I have, and I'm wondering whether the term city has not reached the same state, right? We've put so many stuff in that word that it's a nice word in itself, of course. It's and we have to, in a way, use it anyway because we don't have another. But we should be aware that it's a very tired word. So reason why people come up with metropolis for 30 years now, which is not much better, etc. But maybe we should invent a pension, retirement for words, you know, who were used a lot, you know, and we should give them a good pension and still be very respectful, etc. But, you know, maybe move to something. Anyway, so at that time I thought maybe it's interesting, important that they are not see everything through the lens of that concept of the city, right? And the second thing I said is that there might be a lot of other reasons why their contribution to the issue of urbanism is important. And I summed it up in a stupid way. Sometimes you have to devote yourself to make caricature and be the stupid guy. And I said, maybe we could say that any project whatsoever entails two kinds of reasons, right? There's something we call the program, what has to be built, you know, the reason the commissioners ask for a project and etc. And there is another set of reasons involved in any project, which is the actual situation where it takes place, what we called as a tribe, the site. So it's very stupid, site and program, right? And while in architecture, for some time, you could say during the modernist period or etc., architecture has more often than not envisioned the site through the program. In landscape architecture, it has been traditionally the reverse approach. The program has been envisioned from the site. So you could say, in landscape architectural tradition, the site invents or shapes the program, more or less. For instance, the given topography will be very important in defining what the park or the garden, etc., that you make there will be, right? You cannot plant anything anywhere. When in architecture, it's less the case, and you could say, arguably, that program is, it's much more program-oriented or program-generated practice. Yeah. Of course, as soon as I say that, we'll say, no, it's not true because, etc. Okay, okay. But let's say it's a caricature, it helps. Okay. So I decided to say, what if we called suburbanism this specific approach that we could transpose into urbanism, which is to go from the site to the program instead of the other way around. And it's actually what well, I don't have time for that. It's actually what I saw landscape architect at that time very much doing, right? And this is what the kind of design poetic they were extrapolating in the field of urban design. And I thought that's pretty interesting. Of course, at that time, architects, a kind of vanguard of the most interesting architects, were doing exactly the reverse. Like inventing the site, literally, through the lens of the program. Making programmatic chemistry leading to the invention of, you know, artificial landscape. A building is an artificial topography, in a way. And that was very well illustrated by projects such as the Jussieu Library by Colas in Paris, and many other projects, I could say. And, of course, so I was very interested also in that approach, yeah? Because all those two approaches, suburbanism and what I call superurbanism, the opposite in a way, are trying to find a kind of mixture or perspective between site and program that is quite radical, each being subversion of traditional urbanism at that time, very inspired by Colin Rowe's contextualism, which was basically a matter of making a balance between site and program programmatic issues, right? Contextualizing program or doing the reverse. Here, we had two generative poetics, one starting from the site up to the program, the other one doing exactly the reverse. But of course, super urbanism has an undeserved advantage over suburbanism because it has a hero and even a manifesto. You could arguably say that Delirious New York is the undisputed manifesto for superurbanism, which he called Manhattanism, right? Where literally the program invents the site with the skyscraper, demultiply the stuff. So I will not talk about that, but one of my projects, it's already done, but it needs to be published, is to do a kind of trick, which is, like this is very ambitious, like Marx pretended, you can take Hegel, it's very good, except that you have to put it head down, right, to reverse the thing. So what would happen if you take Delirious New York and you put it, on the head, right? So anyway, this is a game I'd like to do soon. Because in the 70s, this is about books, in the 70s, many books, many important books that were published on urbanism and architecture, I describe as situated or site-specific manifestos, right? These are, it's the learning from syndrome, so early 70s, learning from Las Vegas by the Venturi, Chicago à la carte by Alvin Boyarsky, Los Angeles and the Four Ecologies by Rainer Banham, An architect chooses a given city or territory and says it's very instructive because all the problems, all the issues of urbanism are staged there, and all the strategies we can use, to overcome those problems are illustrated by what is happening here. Yeah? And so, Collage City by Colin Rowe, you could arguably say this is the manifesto for Rome. Rome as a kind of matrix that would be able to digest all the dreams of the architects of futurology, right? Provided they nest, into the contingent fabric of the city. Then it would be, for instance, Berlin as a green archipelago, the city within the city, by Oswald Matthias Ungers and Rem Koolhaas, I must say, which we just recently re-edited with a friend, where it's a manifesto for disurbanism, for degrowth in urbanism, taking Berlin with its different island or Dorf, as a kind of matrix to project the de-urbanization of the city. Or it could be Delirious New York, which is the masterpiece of the genre, right? Calling Manhattanism the theory of super urbanism and taking New York as its stage, as its ecological niche. Hence the idea that I have to take the little city in which these three manifestos have been actually conceived, Ithaca in upstate New York, named after the famous island of Ulysses, right? Where Cornell University is, where those guys were, to take this site as the site of a manifesto for suburbanism that would reverse but this is another story. Another thought that I want to share with you here is about what is a site? What is the nature of a site today? I find a lot of inspiration I found a lot of inspiration in reading what this guy wrote about that. This guy is John Brinkerhoff Jackson, which I translated in French. When I love a text, I translate it because it's like marrying yourself with the argument. And I like him also because he proves that you can drink and still think. Anyway, so anyway, Jackson, in one of the last texts of this book that I just showed the cover, Discovering the Vernacular Landscape, explains that from all his life spent in visiting landscapes everywhere, right, in Europe and in the United States, he summed it up by saying, well, there are three kinds of landscapes. Three kinds of landscape. And it's very weird because reading him, you don't know exactly what he means. Does he mean three periods in the history of landscape? Or does he mean three kinds, three types of landscape? It's unclear, and this very unclearness is stimulating for me. The first landscape, he calls it the medieval landscape or the vernacular landscape. So you see, one is a kind of period, the other one is a type, is a kind of landscape. And he says it has like two characteristics. It's very local, right? It's made with the materials at hand. And second, it's a mosaic of tiny landscapes, right? And then second, it changes all the time. The three-field system of agriculture, it's made with, you know, materials that were ready at hand, but also provisional. So it evolves all the time. Then he says, this, of course, if it's a period, you cannot show it illustrated with contemporary views. But, you know, we know what he means, right? Then he says there is landscape 2, which he calls either the classical, the aristocratic, or the political landscape. And you understand that this would be the landscape that took over from the medieval or vernacular from, let's say, the 16th, 17th century on in Europe. The grid of Jefferson would be it. But also, for instance, it's the super garden, landscape as a super garden. And he says it has two characteristics which are exactly the reverse from the preceding one. When the medieval landscape was a mosaic, a patchwork of small landscape, this one makes sense on much broader scale. And then when the other was changing all the time, this one is pretty fixed, stable. You know, it's the landscape as a super garden. But for instance, the Roman grid was a political landscape for him too, for that very reason. It was a stable one, an attempt at stabilizing the landscape. Of course, the 18th century, the 17th century saw, you know, so many examples. We all know that. And then he says there is landscape 3, and he has no name for that third landscape. He doesn't name it. Does not mean that it's unnameable. It just means that he doesn't name it. But of course, so these are, you know, this is the landscape of today, landscape of the entrances into cities, shoe boxes that change, you know, function all the time. It's a moving, again, landscape. But of course, the title of the book is Discovering the Vernacular Landscape. So what he suggests is that that landscape 3 would have, again, it's not a patchwork, but it has that dynamics of change, you know, of mutating landscape. And that in that sense, it would be something like vernacular landscape. This is what he writes. As I travel about the country, I am often bewildered by the proliferation of spaces and the uses of space that had no counterparts in the traditional landscape. Parking lots, landing fields, shopping centers, trailer courts, high-rise condominiums, wildlife shelters, Disneyland. I am bewildered by our casual use of space, churches used as discotheque, dwelling used as churches, downtown streets used for jogging, empty lots in crowded cities, industrial plants in the open country, cemeteries used for archery practice, Easter sunrise services in a football stadium. I am confused by the temporary spaces I see, the drive-in fast food establishments that are torn down after a year, the fields planted to corn and then to soya beans and then subdivided, the trailer communities that vanish when vacation time is over, the tropical gardens in shopping malls that are replaced each season, motels, etc., etc. You know, and he ended up saying, you know, my second hope, my last hope, I am bewildered, but my second hope, more tolerant, is that all this is part of our culture, that it can be treated with respect, and that here is a new and challenging field for environmental design. What I'm really interested in here is not so much the distinction in itself that he makes of those three layers or three types of landscape, but of the fact that we don't know if it's a type or a period, because it's both. If you look at any landscape today, it's in fact you find all those three landscapes together, right? Of course, you have examples where they are alone, but the superimposition of those different regimes of landscape you can see anywhere, and you know places, you know, where this telescoping of things happen everywhere. Which is when you move to another of his texts, landscape as theater, in another book, he says, landscape too, the classical, the canonical, the one we were taught to love, was conceived, envisioned through a metaphor, which was the theater. A landscape was a scene that made sense from a certain point of view. You know, it was perfect decorum like that. And actually, many books, you know, in 17th and 18th century use the word theater. You know, they are the theater. They are going to open the theater of medicine, the theater of cities for you with those wonderful illustration. These gardens in Fiesole, for instance, operated the integrazione scenica of the landscape, you know, around. So the theater for him was really the driving matrix and metaphor of garden design, of landscapes for a long time. And he said the problem is that it doesn't work anymore. If we still use the metaphor of the theater, then we disable ourselves in front of contemporary situations, right? So this is what he said. We need another metaphor. We're still searching. You know, we haven't found, he said. All that we have so far come up with is an analog of some sort of another borrowed from biology or ecology or communication theory. When it's a matter of controlling and manipulating the environment, analogs can be extremely helpful. Yet, if we are, again, to learn how to respond emotionally and aesthetically and morally to the landscape, we must find a metaphor or several metaphors drawn from our human experience. The fact that we have so far failed to do so is no cause for despair. As history should teach us, and particularly the history of art, it is largely a matter of chronological perspective. It was only in the 19th century that men perceived the rightness of the theater metaphor as applied to the 16th and 17th century concept of landscape. It is only now that we are acquiring sufficient perspective on the 19th century to understand that landscape in terms of a metaphor of growth and decay and evolution, Darwinian, etc. It is still too early to understand the next 20th century landscape. He was writing in the 80s. It is still too early, huh? We can best rely on the insight of the geographer and the artist and the philosopher. They are the most trustworthy custodians of the human tradition, for they seek to discover order within randomness, beauty within chaos, and the enduring aspirations of mankind behind blunders and failures. So, when you go to philosophers and ask them, could you give us a new metaphor? What do they come up with? Right. Here I took two of them. Peter Sloterdijk on the left and Bruno Latour. You know, like everybody in schools of architecture in the States and in France, it's all about Latour and Sloterdijk now. So they actually provide us, you know, concepts. One, the concept of networks. After many others, you know, of actor networks, the landscape and cities are a kind of plumbery, you know, of networks, and being an architect is putting your hand, you know, and becoming the plumber of those stuff. And then you have Peter Sloterdijk, who comes up with the concept of spheres, right? The whole territory, in a way, is a collection of bubbles. Of milieu, of spheres, literally, social or physical, or etc. And you can interpret, in a way, architecture as building up anthropogenic islands in the forms of spheres, literally, of globes, but more than that, bubbles, spheres, and globes, the city is a matter of foam, right? Of foam, of the imbrication, superimposition, and connections of many of those bubbles. And this would be, for him, probably the good metaphor able to replace the theater, to take over from the theater, to replace that thing. And you see actually many architects, Paola Vigano, for instance, or Lin, in the competition for the Grand Paris, you know, relying on that issue of foams and bubbles and stuff in the landscape. I think they're quite useful, but they lack gravity. They lack gravity, and this is the reason why I still stick to two other metaphors that have been launched like for many years, and we're a bit tired with them in a way. One is the famous palimpsest, that equate the territory to the superimposition of many, many layers that you have in a way to decipher. And I like it because it's also a textual metaphor, right? That comes actually from literary critics. André Corbeau's, when he wrote Territory as a Palimpsest, was referring directly, without saying it, to Gérard Genet's palimpsest, saying any text is a palimpsest, is related to many others. You know, there is no pure text appearing all of a sudden. It's all, you can read it only if you know, or if you perceive that it relates to others which are behind. And actually, I discovered recently, about a few years ago, why I like it so much, this metaphor of the palimpsest, because it was proposed for the first time by somebody I love, who is the English opium eater, Thomas de Quincey, who explained in his Confessions of an English Opium Eater, because you can also take opium, I'm not advocating, and still think, why opium would enable you to navigate into the palimpsestuous structure of the mind, and he equated it to that of the territory. So I think we should enroll, mobilize all these metaphors, but also manipulate them with care, and still keep the palimpsest and the hypertext to help us investigate the territories of the city. The other one is the hypertext, because, of course, I think Jackson wouldn't have appreciated the palimpsest as a kind of to replace the theater, because he said that was a curiosity of epigraphy, the fact that people in the ancient time used the same manuscript to lay several texts on top of one another, and then we erase and we rewrite. That is a curiosity of epigraphy. We do not use palimpsest today. So that's the reason why André Corbeau, 20 years after proposing the palimpsest, came to the hypertext, because the hypertext, there is no doubt, we are all plunged, into it. It helps me to show you many things. Our mind is hypertextual, We gather resources from many different sources that were not planned to be gathered, and the hypertext link allow us to put these things together. So we could say that the city, in a way, is hypertextual also. It's between the palimpsest and the hypertext. And we can keep also the metaphor of the theater in it. When you look at the representation, impossible representation of the hyperworld or the internet, you get these, on the web, those fantastic things. But you get also artistic things, such as Marc Lombardi paintings. Do you know these paintings? This is a painting, by the way, which he called a historical painting. It's mapping the relationship of finance in the world, the relation between banks, families, states, sovereignty, and trying to represent it in a kind of picture, one picture like that. And you discover a strange thing, between the family of Ben Laden and the Bush family into it. He documented himself a lot, on all these things, and tried to produce historical painting like that. I see dancer in the... so should I finish in 10 minutes? in 5 minutes? 10? 5? Is that okay with the dancers? Okay. Anyway, Corbeau, in many texts, criticized the very idea that the city could be the seat of harmony anymore. That we had to enter into the 21st century or into the 20th century by abandoning harmony and looking at the work of Klee or Jackson Pollock, you know, and inspires. And he quoted the famous sentence by Lautréamont, the beautiful as the hazardous encounter on a dissecting table of a typewriter and an umbrella, you know. Like that's a surrealist meeting of things that have nothing to do with one another. You know, we could accept it. We didn't have to repress it. The city could be like that, you know, etc., provided it becomes a hyperlink. If you look in Lautréamont, the beautiful as, there are many. And Guy Debord actually preferred the last one here, beautiful as the trembling of hands in alcoholism. So I'm not sure we like drinking that much as to want to that the city would be beautiful as the trembling of hands in alcoholism. These were. But when we think of all this stuff, of how are we going to represent or enter or decipher the space-time matrix of cities, we might find a little interest going back 100 years ago into a very tiny moment in the history of modern art. You know, the first decade of the 20th century, when many artists were fascinated by the idea of the fourth dimension. That we were living in, of course, in a three-dimensional world, but that it was only, you know, an aspect, a facade of a world which is much more complex and we do not totally see, and they would try to represent a four-dimensional. You know, the typical trick of these artists was to say, okay, if a point is the section of a line, if a line is the section of a surface, and if a surface is the section of a volume, what is a volume the section of? Right? And so that was the idea, you know? And so they all went into trying to represent hypercube, their big success in literature, Flatland, or the voyage to the pays of the fourth dimension, you know? In Flatland, he imagines a world in 2 dimensions. It's very sexist, by the way, because women's are lines and men's surfaces. And anyway, and so they perceive only an infra-thin, you know, portion of what they really are. And when a sphere goes through Flatland, it's first a point, then a circle, a circle, a circle, then the circle diminishes, and it's a point, and it disappears. So it's time, you know. So time, you know, from the 1915 on, with the theories of relativity going on, everybody would accept that time was the fourth dimension. But before that, they tried to kind of physically, you know, represent it. And one guy who spent literally his life into this thing is Marcel Duchamp. Duchamp, who, you know, trying to represent time, you know, they're like other cubists, process in a coffee grinder, for instance, which he cuts like that and showing all the process of the grinding of coffee. A game of chess, 2 strategies, you know, confronting one another, you know, and trying to enter into the mind of the other. So 2 collapsing mind would be an instance of the fourth dimension. The passage from the virgin to the bride, mutation, you know. Organic mutation there. And, of course, the great mandala, his masterpiece, the bride stripped bare by her bachelors, even bizarre stuff, which is all about, you know, the domain of the bachelors rendered into very 3D, you know, perspective rendering, where you have the 9 Malik molds, you know, connected to a kind of mill, water mill, and to a chocolate grinding machine. He writes a note saying, the bachelors grin their chocolate alone. And they try to enter into a kind of communication with the bride, which is blossoming in a so-called four-dimensional space, and is separated from the bachelors by the mantle between things. So it's a kind of pataphysical meditation about sexual desire and sex as being, you know, a domain in which you reach, in a way, the four-dimensional, but it's also, behind that, a meditation on the relationship of our three-dimensional world with a four-dimensional reality, space-time reality. And you could compare those two things. You know, that's the theatrical matrix, the three landscapes perspectively arranged, the garden, the second nature of agriculture, and wild, the first nature, or the wild nature in the background. And this aha, which looks like a tennis net, completely separates the garden from what it represents, the two other nature behind. In Duchamp, right, the two are superimposed. So I think, and this is my last, one before last thing I want to say, is we should verticalize landscape. You know, every landscape is a hyper landscape. We should see them, arrange them, project them, design, care for them sectionally, you know, and not only in plan there. And we find in Duchamp a kind of interesting, yeah, okay. And I'm not the first to say that. Actually, I discovered a few years ago that Lars Lerup, who also does not believe in the concept of city anymore, after the city, was looking at Houston through the window, four-dimensional window of the large glass and seeing new things in things. So I'd like to conclude with just a few suggestions of readings, not for the workshop. Very important books for me. One is this one. John McNeill, a historian of the environment, who wrote one of the most important books of the late 20th century in 2000, which is called Something New Under the Sun, and which is an environmental history of the 20th century, explaining to what extent the 20th century made us enter into the Anthropocene and how it degraded, you know, the ecosphere, both the atmosphere, the lithosphere, the hydrosphere, and the biosphere. You know, so it's a fantastic book. Another book that I think you should read at some point, it will be, or it is now translated in Italian. It's sold 500,000 copies in the States, which is quite rare for a book of economy, is Thomas Piketty's The Capital in the 21st Century, which is looking at, and when we talk about capital, we talk about territories, we talk about architecture, we talk about the stock of built stuff and riches, and which is looking at how that stock is distributed in countries today. It's the political side, in a way, of that issue. And he's suggesting, as you may have heard, suggesting for a kind of ideal imposition now on capital and everything everywhere, and re-establishing work in front of capital and patrimonium as a very important issue. But believing also in the global, that the global world and financial world is sustainable, provided that we, you know, tax things everywhere now on a global level. And also, on a completely different note, a book you may have heard of, which is for me the best book ever written in the tradition of neo-situationist thoughts, of people who believe that there is no hope in the global system, that it cannot be amended, and who go all for commune, autonomy, secession there. This book is a quite inspiring thing today. I just took a quote from it. The situation is like this. They hired our parents to destroy this world, and now they'd like to put us to work rebuilding it and to add insult to injury at a profit. And I will finish by 3 very little quotes. You know all that thing. Think global, act local. That should be, you know, the motto of sustainable environmental thought today. We have to think globally and act globally. Okay. But I think we should add the time scale to that thing. And Proust actually in 1920 had already said, we should think as if we were eternal and worked as if we were to die tomorrow. That's maybe a good thing for the workshop. And then a last one by another hero, Karl Marx, about hope. I wrote one day a book about the art of memory, but now, you know, the ancient needed an art of memory because they couldn't keep memory of things. They couldn't write, they had no computers, they had everything. So they had an art of memory. Hope today is not something you have easily. So we have to devise an art of hope. Right? In a way, we could say other disciplines, they have to envision themselves as an art of hoping, which is active. And Marx said in a letter to Ruge, you will not say that I have had too high an opinion of the present time. And if nevertheless I do not despair of it, that is only because it is precisely the desperate situation that fills me with hope. And to water down a little that thing, I found actually the expression, the art of hoping, in 18th century Vauvenargues, where he said, patience is the art of hoping. So active patience to work against desperation. But in any case, and that be my conclusion, I do think that the ultimate task of architecture, landscape architecture, and urbanism is to give space to time, literally, and to give time to space. Because it's not said, it's not certain, it's not given that it will have much space and that we have much time and space ahead of us. Thank you for your attention.